Between 1857 and 1996, more than 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children were sent by the Canadian government to special institutions called Indian residential schools. 130 schools were built and operated by the Government of Canada, and the country's mainline churches, the Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and United Churches. Beginning in the mid-1990s, thousands of former students sued the churches that ran residential schools and the federal government that funded them. They sought compensation for the loss of language and culture, as well as the abuse suffered in these schools. This led to larger civil suits that were resolved in 2005 with the negotiation of the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. Since then, the number of abuse claimants has been nearly double the original estimate. The total number of residential schools in Canada peaked at 80 in 1931. By 1945, there were more than 9,000 students in residential schools, about half the Aboriginal student population. In schools close to and on reserves, or those much farther away, the students' time was divided. One part of their day was spent attending classes, the other learning farming and trades. This policy of aggressive assimilation removed many children from their families and communities for 10 months out of the year. Within a few generations, native languages and traditions diminished or were wiped out altogether, as students were forced to speak, dress, think, and act like non-Aboriginal Canadians. An estimated 80,000 former students are still living today. Of those, nearly 7% attended United Church-run schools. Many of their children and grandchildren now lag behind in formal education, just as they once did. It's said that a third of all Aboriginals have less than a high school education. One result is that the unemployment rate for Aboriginals between 25 and 64 remains almost twice the rate for non-Aboriginals, roughly 13%. On reserves, as much as 25% remain unemployed. But it's the trauma, neglect, and humiliation that survivors experienced that greatly contributed to many social problems in Aboriginal communities today. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, drug abuse, alcoholism, and incarceration are higher among Aboriginals than other parts of the population. And in a tragic twist, those who suffered abuse and dislocation in residential schools are prone to perpetuating family and community dysfunction in the future.
It's important to note that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is unique among all TRCs in the world. We are the first and only one that has ever been created because of the actions of the so-called victims of harms. It was the former students who, when they were children, had no power, no voice to do or say anything about what was happening to them. And for many, many years, their parents didn't either, because the Indian Act had such restrictions in it that their parents were not allowed to take action, in fact were threatened with jail, and some did go to jail if they tried to do anything contrary to the government and church policies about their children being in the schools. But those laws gradually changed. As of 1960, Aboriginal people in Canada finally had the right to vote in Canada and in federal elections. A number of major Indigenous organizations formed, and the voice of individual and collective Indigenous peoples became a force that could not be ignored, and that had a vehicle to get itself before the Canadian courts. And so that's what happened. The individual survivors, as they're called, and then eventually several together in what became a massive class action lawsuit, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, came before the Canadian courts and said what happened to us was not right and we need redress. One of the provisions of a massive out-of-court settlement involving the federal government, 4 national churches, the Catholic entities, several of them, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as well as the Assembly of First Nations and the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. They all, and of course the legal representatives for the survivors themselves, they agreed to this massive out-of-court settlement, and one of the provisions which the survivors themselves fought very hard for was the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission then, first and foremost, created a vehicle for those children, now adults, to tell us and teach us the truthful history from their perspective of what had happened to them as little children, what the residential schools had meant to them, their families, and their own subsequent families, and the kind of connective tissue, if I can put it that way, between what happened to them historically and the reality that we see in so much of Canada today about the challenges that are facing so many individuals that we see on the streets of our urban settings, so many of the communities that are living in the absence of some of the basic and fundamental things that are needed, housing, water, and certainly educational outcomes, but also to provide a platform for demonstrating unbelievable courage, unbelievable resilience, the bravery with which people have come forward and spoken from the depths of their heart and sometimes extremely dire experiences, to be able to say today, this is what I have done, this is how I have reclaimed my life, this is how I am reclaiming my life, and this is what I want our country and our world to learn from this experience.
Now, the survivors of Native residential schools on southern Vancouver Island are preparing to share their heartbreak and their stories of abuse. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made its way down the island and will be in Victoria tomorrow and on Saturday and is ready to listen. And the Commission hopes you are too. The event at the Victoria Conference Centre is open to the public. As CTV's Andrew Johnson shows us, the hurt inflicted on these young people decades ago is still felt today.
This blunt description of Native residential schools is part of a resistance narrative, a digital story put together by UVic student Alexandra Kent. She and 6 others have researched the schools and the terrible things that were done to children there for more than a century.
The more I learn about it, the more devastating it is. It's really a heart-wrenching story, and I don't think many Canadians know the full truth behind it.
Many in this room do and can't escape it. The videos were screened today at UVic's First People's House in front of those whose lives have been shaped by what went on inside residential schools decades ago.
Both my parents went to residential school. Both of them had passed away when I was a lot younger, for sure, based on the impacts of the residential schools through addictions. And part of my story is that because of their passings, I did grow up in foster care.
Shaylee Robinson's family will never be the same either.
My great-grandma experienced residential school, so then she put it onto her kids, and then onto her kids, and then onto my mom. So it's never ending.
At the Victoria Conference Centre tomorrow and Saturday, we will hear stories of abuse so terrible it may be difficult to imagine it all happened here in Canada on our watch. But it did, and Vancouver Islanders to this day are still living with the pain.
When we talk about the residential school experience, we're talking over 100 years. I said directly impacting 150,000 young, innocent children. And for the longest time, and I'm talking years and years, our community wasn't willing and probably unable to confront this part of our, this significant part of our experience. And it took a lot of people to bring us to the point where we could actually speak about it within families, communities, and then, of course, publicly, so that we could share with Canadians this part of their history as well. It isn't just an experience or a history of our community, it's Canada's experience, it's Canada's history.
The impacts of the legacy of residential schools still feels like a long shadow cast over the hearts and minds of not only First Nations, direct survivors of the experience, the generation that came after, which includes me. I think, though, it's also casting a dark shadow, a long shadow across the entire country. One that requires, in that case, for light to be shone. And that's what's happening at this moment. It feels like the moment that we're in, the moment that we're heading into the near and medium and far future is one of exposing, telling the truth. And really it's about, in that respect, learning, perhaps unlearning what people thought, the myths, the stereotypes, if you will, the misunderstandings, the gaps in real information. That's all now coming to light. Everything from nutrition experiments to 6-year-olds having their tongues pricked when they tried to speak the only language that they knew how to when they went to school for the first or second time as kids. And that's the moment that we're in. So it's a legacy of overcoming deep misunderstanding and now arriving at a place of learning and greater understanding.
Tomorrow could be a milestone day for Canada's relationship with the First Nations. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issues its report after 5 years, hearing 7,000 witnesses with a price tag of about $60 million. It will document in great detail the experience of about 150,000 Aboriginal children who were taken away from their families for schooling in what is being called a cultural genocide. Well, the National Chief from the Assembly of First Nations speaks for Canada's Aboriginal population. Perry Bellegarde joins me in the studio. Chief Bellegarde, tomorrow's the truth.
Yes.
What's the reconciliation?
Well, I think the operative word will be implementation and action, in terms of the report that's coming down. You're going to hear a lot of recommendations, but if they're not implemented, what's the point?
Reconciliation is more than money. This is going into programming. What do you envision it's going to require to reconcile these horrible stats with what's gone on?
Well, reconciliation, I've said, can take many shapes. It could be education reconciliation to deal with the shortfall in funding on reserve versus off reserve. Like, there's a huge gap. $6,500 per tuition per child on reserve. Off reserve, it's $10,500. In the French school system, almost 20. So that's education reconciliation. There's economic reconciliation. To look at concepts like revenue sharing, to really share the land and resource wealth, because it's poverty that plagues our people. There's housing reconciliation, because we have overcrowded housing. We need 130,000 homes, to catch up. We have access to potable water, so there's reconciliation, all those things. But more fundamentally, I think it's a relationship as well with Canada. It's not just with governments, but with all Canadians and how they view Indigenous peoples. And I keep saying, get rid of discrimination, racism, and all those misconceptions you have, so new things can come in. Acceptance and validation of our identity and our history and our cultures here. Put aside colonization and oppression and embrace the reality that we're all in this together.
Are you worried, though, we're six months from now, in the heat of an election campaign, all this stuff disappears into archives and dust? Do you worry about that?
Of course I worry about that. But that's why I keep reaching out to all Canadian people to make these issues not only First Nations issues, they're Canadian issues. And let's keep the pressure on governments, no matter who gets in on October 19th. They've got to deal with these things, because it's not only good for our people, it's good for Canada. So when we win on any front, it's good for all of Canada. When we get proper schools on our reserves, that's good for everybody, because our kids can get proper education so they can compete in today's economy, this global economy. That's a positive thing. That's a win for everybody.
And yet you saw what happened. The government tried to do that education bill, and they didn't feel they could come to terms with First Nations in a much broader community sense. How can you overcome that?
Again, we've got some responsibility ourselves to developing our own systems of governance, our own school systems. We need school systems with proper transparency, openness, and accountability. That basically, we want the best education for our kids. We don't want just a status quo. We want the best education, strong on math and science, strong on literacy and reading. But as well, equally important is the pride in who you are, your language and your ceremonies, your traditions, customs. That's got to be in there. So we have to look at standards, but First Nations control standards that will meet and or exceed provincial government standards.
Exactly. Nathan?
I was in the House. Many Canadians watched when the Prime Minister made the official apology for residential schools those years ago. How would you describe the development since that point? Because many had looked to that and hoped that maybe that was going to be part of the reconciliation, where government gets up and apologizes for past mistakes. Are we continuing to make those mistakes, or has there been a shift? How would you describe the trend since that moment?
Well, we hold up the Prime Minister and the government for apologizing, no question.
Yeah.
It was a powerful movement, a powerful statement when he made those words, 8 years ago. But again, words will be empty and meaningless without action. So let's look back in the past 8 years in terms of what's transpired.
Right.
We had $170 million for First Nations languages. That was cut back. You know, we had all Aboriginal organizations across Canada cut back. We had some institutions like the Aboriginal Healing Foundation cut back and
which
closed.
was meant to help.
Exactly. So has the relationship improved? Not quite there, no. So since the apology, we still see the huge socioeconomic gap that exists. So there has not been the key strategic investments in education and training and housing and water. So we've got a ways to go.
Were you surprised when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court came out and called this a cultural genocide?
I was very pleasantly surprised. I was deeply moved, you know, when the Supreme Court of Canada Justice called this cultural genocide, because that's what it is. It was to kill the Indian in the child. And it was like we were viewed as savages and pagan people. You know, we couldn't own property, we couldn't vote, we couldn't do any of those things because we were looked upon as less than humans. And so the government had this policy of civilize, assimilate, terminate, you know, and so it really, when the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice McLaughlin said that, I held her up high.
Yeah.
Because now that should drive all policy and legislation, the decision makers, you know, going forward, that if the Supreme Court's saying that, the legislative and the executive branch of government should listen and start doing things properly according to all policy and legislation in that framework going forward.
But, you know, the minister stood up on the House of Commons today and gave the statement. We got a bit of it off the top of the show here. And there were 18 Conservative MPs in the House. What does that say? Or
Well,
nothing?
again,
There may be busy people, but...
maybe they're busy people, but again, this is so important. I would have loved to have the whole House of Commons full. This is such an important issue because it's a Canadian issue. It's not just a First Nations issue. It's a Canada issue. The dark chapter, we have a shared history here, but we also have a shared responsibility. So decision makers in the House of Commons should embrace this report. There should be that implementation and action plan to implement all those recommendations that will be forthcoming. And so to have that many in there, it doesn't send the proper message right now, but there's room. They can improve. There's still time. So don't put it on the shelf, guys. Let's look at implementation now.
And if they don't, what happens in the First Nations communities across the country?
Well, one of the things we're starting to do now, because remember First Nations didn't get the right to vote till 1961.
I know, that's incredible, isn't it?
And so now we have this thing called trying to mobilize the vote, because if we do get out to vote, there's 51 ridings that could be affected, you know, and we can still work on sovereignty and nationhood and jurisdiction. You know, but this concept of dual citizenship, because we need to get First Nations people around every table where decisions are made that affect our lives. That means cabinet. That means private sector boardrooms. That means management teams in public and private sector. Wherever decisions are made, we need First Nations people. And so if that's cabinet, then we've got to look down that road.
So there will be a political action consequence if they ignore this.
Well, we're hoping, because we can influence 51 ridings.
All right. Chief Bellegarde, thanks very much. Appreciate you joining us.
Okay.
Obviously, there's going to be a lot more today from that commission, and we're going to hear from all the stakeholders and interested parties as well. But let's bring in Mercedes Stephenson right now to talk a little bit about this very historic and important day in Canada. Mercedes, there are 94 recommendations, so obviously very difficult to go through all of them. But what did you take away from this report, and what are some of the key recommendations we need to know?
So I think some of the key areas with his recommendations, first of all, is education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission wants to see not only Aboriginal children educated about what happened in the residential schools, but also all Canadians, whether they are of non-Aboriginal descent or recent immigrants, no matter what. They say, and they keep emphasizing, it's not just an Aboriginal issue, because you can't have true reconciliation until people know what happened and understand what the intergenerational effects of this have been on, they say, things like alcoholism, on things like childcare. Aboriginal children, they say, are 8 times more likely to be removed from their family home than children of other descent. So they want to deal with that through changing the education system, looking at having more Aboriginal programs as well in universities to try to ensure access, the possibility of having languages taught, Aboriginal languages in universities. And one of the suggestions is even that there be a requirement, possibly, that there would be a course required for all undergraduates in Canada to take in Aboriginal studies. Now, beyond that, they also have recommendations about the justice system. They say that Aboriginals are grossly overrepresented in terms of the population inside of Canada's justice system. They want action on things like understanding how people who are suffering from fetal alcohol system interact with the system and the way that they are treated. They also want to have the government, whoever the Prime Minister is, put out an annual report on the state of reconciliation so they can see where they're moving. And a lot of that that will deal with monitoring how Aboriginal children are doing, where are their health markers, how is their education coming along, and whether or not they are able to stay with their families. So those are just some of the very broad recommendations, and some are very specific, Jen, and they reach to all levels of government, but a large number of them are targeted at the federal government and looking for a new relationship with the Crown. They even call on the government to repudiate the ideas of discovery, that whoever finds it gets to claim it, which extends to a lot of the Aboriginal lands in Canada. So you're talking about a whole new relationship, and they want essentially a declaration from the Crown that there is a nation-to-nation sovereign relationship with First Nations in Canada. Unlikely that they will see all 94 of these come to fruition, but it'll be fascinating to see which ones the federal government agrees to and how they make progress on that.
Well, and that was my next question. What guarantees, if any, are there that any of these recommendations will be adopted moving forward?
Well, I mean, essentially, there's none, right? There's no mechanism to force this. There's no requirement. This is not a report that has legal standing in that sense, even though it is a justice who we heard from. It is about political will, and you heard some of the commissioners talk about that. This is about the political will not only of First Nations people, but they hope that other Canadians, when they read this report, and when you hear some of those survivor stories that are just heart-wrenching about the way little children were treated, that people will react and that they will understand some of the challenges that First Nations are facing, how some of these situations have come about, and to try to really start that healing process. And they say that it's the political will of not only Aboriginals, because that may not be enough, but you have to have other people kicking in. And certainly this is something that some groups like the Assembly of First Nations are hoping will become potentially an election issue, because there are 51 ridings, the National Chief says, across Canada where First Nations could have a significant impact on the vote.
You know, we heard some of those stories in some of the videos that they were showing during this unveiling of the Commission's report. And we also heard some really key facts, which were so disturbing. The fact that a lot of these residential schools that housed as many, thousands and thousands of Aboriginal children had no playgrounds, but they had cemeteries. You know, shocking statements like that, Mercedes, that stand out. And the fact that this is generational, this happened over many, many generations. There is an understanding it's going to take at least another generation to make things right.
Yeah, this is not something that they think is going to be healed tomorrow. And as you say, the tremendous grief of not only losing a child or sibling or being forcibly separated from your parents, forced to speak a language that these children had not heard before, being treated terribly, being, having their identity erased. And you heard one of the commissioners say, some of these people can't answer where they're from. They don't know. They were taken away so young, and that they were told that their identity was wrong and bad, and so it was erased from them. They were beaten. They were sexually abused. They didn't receive adequate health care. When one federal government doctor who was kind and compassionate came forward and voiced his concerns, he was fired instead of action being taken. They talk about the abusers being protected, and you get this sense of this incredible grief that had to come from the way that these children were treated, and the deaths of many of them, not even marked, not even a gravestone. Their parents were not told they died until after they were buried. I think for any parent out there to imagine what that would be like for your child, or to imagine what it would be like for you as a child to be taken from your parents and forced into these very austere and often abusive circumstances, they're saying, look, there has been a domino effect. This means people who came from happy families but then were raised with abuse don't know how to care for their own children, may have substance abuse issues because they're trying to deal with past grief that they've never received counseling for. And so there's a lot of issues, but they're hoping this airing of it will shock, I think, a lot of Canadians into saying, look, what can we do to try to rebuild?
Lots more to come on this story. Mercedes, thank you so much for your insight.
You're welcome.
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa.
Kim Campbell once said that elections were not the best time to deal with serious issues. How wrong she was. For really serious ones, they might be the only time. The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission deals with this country's most pressing and sensitive moral challenge. Its findings add detail and testimony to a great, sad narrative of this country. It recharges most Canadians' sense that beyond sympathy and apology, facing up to the necessity of repairing relations between Aboriginal peoples and all other Canadians. Sympathy and apology are good and necessary, but they've never been sufficient. Nor is the sense of near collective shame that Canadians, I believe, genuinely feel despite its moral merit, amount to an effective response. That response, like the sympathy and apologies, has to find a practical outlet, one that relates to actual situations, measurable improvement, and an end to the barren cycle of bursts of compassion followed by long intervals of evasive neglect. That is why, in all matters beyond the substance of this report, the timing of it is significant, and why, on this most central of issues in Canadian politics, the timing adds to its power. For this is a moment when Kim Campbell's comment is most off the mark. We've had a lot of talk about the leaders' debates, who hosts them, where they're going to be held, all the usual stuff, all about process and political advantage. With the release of this report, we now have a cardinal issue on which to hold those debates. More, we have a cardinal issue on which each of the parties and their leaders have at least 6 months to give serious and considered thought on what they would actually do, beyond sentiment and lip service, to alter the patterns that have left Aboriginal peoples on the edge of mainstream society, caught in patterns of dysfunction and wide poverty, and stranded from what should be the rights and privileges of every citizen in modern Canada. We can leave all the trivia of politics behind on this issue and ask, particularly of our leaders, what, in specifics and substance, in results that can and will be measured, they propose to do to effect the deep repair of an historical, generational, and grievous wrong. This should not be an election issue, but the election issue. For unless the report receives the full political engagement that an election represents, unless each party offers to the voters its serious and detailed response to it, then this report, for all the attention and honorable response of the last few days, will be just one more bright flare sent up to an empty sky, something that offered a showy moral gratification for a few days, and then, like so many other moments before, was allowed to pass without the action and commitments that a true seriousness would demand. For The National, I'm Rex Murphy.